What do you guys think? Are Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis the same thing? Why are they always talked about together? Today we're going to be taking a look at some of the similarities and differences between these two diseases, so stay tuned. Alright, so I think to start this conversation we should start talking about inflammatory bowel disease pathogenesis. And what that means is basically, where does the disease come from? How does it start in our body? And to answer this question shortly, it's idiopathic. We don't exactly know how it starts. But recent research suggests that it's actually a combination of a couple different factors. And I've taken a screenshot of one of the most recent reviews on this from back in 2015. They wrote a review about the causes of inflammatory bowel disease. And there were four main things that they talked about contributing to inflammatory bowel disease. And the first one is genetic susceptibility. So that just means that within your genes, within your chromosomes and your DNA, in each of your cells, if you're so lucky to have it, you could have a certain type of mutation or allele that says that that makes you more susceptible to inflammatory bowel disease. And we'll get more into that in the next couple slides. But the next thing that they say could have partial cause is immune dysregulation. And so that's just referring to, I'm sure you've heard that inflammatory bowel disease is kind of an autoimmune disease. And when doctors are prescribing medications, typically a lot of the medications that they prescribe for us are autoimmune related medications. Things like Remicade and Humira. They're all trying to suppress our immune system. The third thing that they say could be partial part of the cause is the microbial flora dysbiosis. And so what that's talking about is, in all of our gastrointestinal tracts there is tons of bacteria. In fact, so much bacteria that you have more bacterial cells in your intestines than you do cells of your own. And that's actually true for your whole body. So if you took all the cells that make up you, and you took all the bacterial cells within your body, they would actually outnumber you. So this is actually a really important thing when it comes to diseases. There's actually been a lot of research that suggests that the microbial flora in your gut is actually really important for several different things. So what can happen is you have good bacteria and bad bacteria, and the good bacteria basically helps your digestion. The bad bacteria can do things to hurt your digestion. They can produce different materials that cause an immune response within your body, and we're going to get into that in the next couple slides. But that's that idea of microbial flora dysbiosis. And the last thing that they say could play a factor in all this is the environment. And mostly what they're talking about with the environment is they're talking about whether you've smoked, whether you are a smoker or a non-smoker. They talk about your diet and things like that. And then also whether or not you have certain pathogens within your GI tract. So say you ate something bad. In my case, that could have been something that I ate when I was in Ecuador. So those are the four things that we're going to be talking about when we talk about where this disease comes from and why we have it. Move on and take a closer look at this first point, genetic susceptibility. And if you see here on the left, I have a diagram from a different study in 2016 that was also a review of the pathophysiology behind inflammatory bowel disease. And this is a really, really, really dumbed down version of what I saw in the article. They talked about, they had actually presented what seemed to be like hundreds of different genes that can be involved in the pathogenesis and pathophysiology of inflammatory bowel disease. But here in this diagram, we see that there are basically three of these main types of genes involved in Crohn's disease, and then one of them that is separate that's involved in ulcerative colitis. And unless you're a geneticist, really, there's not much to talk about. Just know that if you have inflammatory bowel disease, there could be a lot of genes that could be either upregulated or downregulated within your body, and that could be causing part of the inflammatory bowel disease. And if we move forward, we're going to get into the idea of that microbial flora dysbiosis and immune dysregulation. So if you remember from last video, we talked about the GI tract mucosa and how that's the innermost layer, the layer inside your GI tract that's touching the food and the outside world. And if we look at this diagram over here from the study I was just looking at, this layer of cells is supposed to represent that mucosa. Another word for that would be epithelium. It's just a layer of cells that's the innermost layer. And the epithelium of your GI tract actually produces a lot of mucus, and the types of cells that do that are called goblet cells. And so the point of the mucus is to protect the cells from things like bacteria and pathogens in the food that you eat. And looking at this diagram, what's happening here is that the bacteria is actually crossing over that mucus layer and getting into the epithelial layer. And what this research article suggests is that the immune system thus triggers a pro-inflammatory response after exposure to bacterial antigens. So what's going to happen is this bad bacteria is going to pass the mucus layer, get in contact with the epithelial layer, and your body is going to think, hey, this is bad, we need to stop this. And so your immune system kicks in and starts an inflammatory response. And that's where the inflammatory part comes from in inflammatory bowel disease. And it could happen from things that aren't even necessarily bad. And that's why you have this inappropriate response with people who are otherwise healthy, and they start getting the symptoms of inflammatory bowel disease. And the last part that we talked about was the environment. And I have two little paragraphs from that same study in 2016 that talks about two specific things. Smoking, first, actually increases your risk twofold to have Crohn's disease, and then also with ulcerative colitis. And then in this second paragraph, it talks about how ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease can be related to the type of diet you have. Specifically, if you have a high sucrose or high fructose diet, something high sugar with high carbs and low fiber can possibly cause the ulcerative colitis. And then what we're going to get into now is some of the main differences between these two diseases. I know at the beginning of the video I asked, are these things the same? What do you guys think about that? And the truth is they're actually really different. In the middle here, I have just a quick diagram that really outlines some of the main differences between these two. So with Crohn's disease, you can actually get inflammation anywhere throughout your GI tract. And not only can it be anywhere, but it can also go through all the layers. So remember in the last video, we talked about the mucosa and the submucosa and the muscularis. Well, Crohn's disease can go much deeper than ulcerative colitis can, and it can happen anywhere throughout. And usually what happens is it'll happen in what are called skip lesions. So it'll affect one portion of your tract, and then it'll move on, and maybe another portion of your tract will be affected. Whereas when we look at ulcerative colitis, it's only in your large intestine. It's only in the colon. And usually, as we see here, usually it's pretty continuous. So it'll start in your rectum, and it'll move its way up through your large intestine until it gets all the way to the end. And I guess you could say the one good thing about ulcerative colitis is that it only affects the very innermost layer. It's only going to be affecting the mucosa. And I have two colonoscopy pictures. This one on the left here is Crohn's disease. So you see how it has what they call cobblestone. And that's, if you see here, there's kind of these bumps. And that's just because the Crohn's disease goes much deeper. And looking at this picture right here of a colonoscopy of ulcerative colitis, you can tell it looks much more like it's on the surface layer. It looks like that, if you remember from the other video, we had a nice pink appearance in the large intestine, and here it looks really bloody and kind of messed up, but it looks like it's just on the surface layer. So these are some of the main differences between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And then I included this diagram because I liked it a lot. It shows a lot of the differences between these two. So this is the normal. If we look at this top row right here, this is going to be all normal. So you see it, the large intestine looks nice and pink. The cells here look good. nothing wrong with it. And then we look at Crohn's disease, and it looks pretty bad. It looks like it's going a little bit deeper. The cells look messed up. In this diagram, you see here that it shows that it goes deep through all the layers, and it skips around throughout your GI tract. And then down here you have the ulcerative colitis, and it's continuous, starting in the rectum, moving up. It only affects this top layer here, and you see it moves on, and this is what the cells look like under a slide, under a microscope, and then finally you see the colonoscopy picture of it. So why are these diseases so closely related? And the reason is really because the symptoms are almost spot on the same. But for both of you, you're going to get diarrhea, rectal bleeding, urgency with your bowel movements. You're going to get all the abdominal pain. And any of you who are watching who have this, you certainly know exactly what I'm talking about. So when you go into the doctor and you tell him these are your symptoms, really it could be one of the two, and they're not going to be able to tell until they do a colonoscopy or get a biopsy and look at the actual cells. And so that's why these diseases are so closely related, is because the symptoms, you really, on the surface, you look exactly the same, but you have to really get in there to look at it to be able to tell the difference. But that is it for this video. So the next video we're going to get into is some of the common misconceptions, and these are going to be the things that you're going to hear from friends and family, maybe about diet or lifestyle, that isn't necessarily going to agree with the research that's out there. And so we're going to clear up some of those misconceptions, and I wanted to thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for the next video. We'll see you then.